Wizards of the Coast has officially confirmed that we are not unbanning Splinter Twin, and I think not enough people are talking about it. The reasons behind it are actually very important for us to understand as well in terms of bad play patterns and the overall unban philosophy. But this whole unbanned twin meme and this discussion is kind of just circling around each other and just not really leading to anything. From this discussion about a week and a half ago from the weekly MTG, we have a couple folks sitting down to discuss the philosophy behind banning and unbanning. And they mention a couple things in terms of what they'll do if they unban a card or what they'll do if they ban a card, and what they want to do in terms of a group. They want to solve things all together and maybe not a piece at a time. And they've learned a lot over the years. So I want to go through the clip right now and just go into an overall discussion about how bad play patterns just are something to really look out for in a game and how we can solve them, and also bring in some other creators that have their own insights as well. Let's go into the clip.
So we'll just run through these quickly. Unbanned Twin.
We talked about this last time.
We did. We're going to talk about it every time.
I said it's okay. Yes, I understand, and even in this article, right, I said there was a card ban in 2008, and we're finally letting it loose 14, 16 years later. Times have changed. Magic has changed. It's different now. Some things are probably there that don't need to be there, and we're looking for those things. But I believe
Modern Horizons 2 Elementals.
I can speak for most of our team that we are pretty resistant to freeing the twin. It's just, I know cards are stronger now, but that really tight squeeze of that 3 mana, 4 mana turn where you can no longer tap out, but technically you're supposed to make them have it, but it's just really not ideal.
Okay, so this line here is actually really important, and what ultimately changes my mind on the twin unbanning. There's a lot of cards, if you'll watch my shorts and everything, I agree with on the fact that they should be unbanned. I think there's a lot of experimentation that could be done. Preordained was a very good example of this. I think other cards like Glimpse of Nature could also see that unbanned. But I think the idea of bad play patterns is important because of what it forces you to do. And the Cascade decks were doing exactly that. I will say, though, in a lot of ways, there are other cards that force these type of play patterns too. Orcish Bowmasters can force this, the One Ring can do this, and honestly, high key, Wrenn and 6 also gets away with this for free way too often. I think Wrenn and 6 is just being overshadowed by too many powerful things, but Wrenn and 6 has been a problem in Modern for way too long, and it has actually been causing genuine bad play patterns, and again, just been getting away with it.
I mean, is there a day where it happens? Perhaps. Never say never. Don't hold your breath.
One other point there, like, if you read some of our logic in the last BNR update and kind of what we've already talked about today, where we talked about the unhealthy play pattern with Rhinos and Violent Outburst, end step on your opponent's turn and then untapping and essentially winning, you can just kind of predict that forward with Splinter Twin. You kind of read between the lines of what we think is actually fun or a healthy play pattern to promote.
Yep. We won't go through all of the unban requests because I think everyone's having a
And again, you can obviously argue things like Spell Pierce exists in the format. We have Leyline Binding, and we have a lot of options to answer these things, but it doesn't mean that every deck should be full of answers. We then just walk into the territory of Legacy, where the deck is policed by things like Force of Will and Daze, but then the more busted things are allowed in that format. So decks just end up being one of two formulas. You're either doing something extremely busted or you're playing Force of Will. Right? And that's what it is. That is the dichotomy of Legacy. And although it does lend to some very powerful and interactive Magic, that's because it uses the history of all of Magic the Gathering with the ban list. Modern doesn't do that. Modern doesn't have access to all of the same cards that Legacy does, and we don't want Modern to become Legacy. So I think separating it is very important, and this discussion around bad play patterns is also a very interesting one. And I want to hop into a clip just from a video that, on this channel you'll probably seen a couple times so far, from the Distraction Makers talking about bad play patterns. What I want to do is look at the first section of the video. I think the first couple 4 or 5 minutes of this are really important to the Splinter Twin discussion and just play pattern discussion. We're going to bring it back around to the BNR, but let's hop right into what these two fantastic folks have to say about bad play patterns.
Makers. So I was listening to a update from Wizards of the Coast about banned and restricted list, and one of the things that they kept saying was they're trying to incentivize positive play patterns.
Almost like I chose these two
remove
clips
negative play patterns from the game
to bring it together for a reason.
It got me thinking about, like, I don't know if that many people know what that means. You know, like they talk about that in the sense that, like, oh, look, everybody just knows what a positive and negative play pattern is.
It's also super subjective because you can have some players that really, really have a lot of fun playing a negative play.
So as a mill player, I can see what this is about. Ultimately, where I will land on this, and we'll kind of see as this video develops here, that there are bad play patterns that currently exist that are good for the game. We see this largely in Legacy. There are a ton of bad, terrible, negative play patterns and bad decks in the format that ultimately get policed by Force of Will and Daze. That is the nature of the Legacy format in Magic the Gathering. It leads to good play patterns in the sense of how it is policed, and it leads to good interaction and back and forth. Modern is not that format. When it comes to unbanning Splinter Twin in Modern, we have to take into account the type of answers that we have, how we answer these cards that they're going to play, and the modes and the fields that these bad play pattern decks interact with, or that we can interact with. Do they play to the board? Do they play to the hand? Do they play in their graveyard? Do they play with their deck? Are they playing with zones that generally Magic cards and just decks in general aren't equipped to deal with? That is kind of where these outliers are.
What I thought we should do is talk a bit about what we see as positive and negative play patterns, and talk through some of the ways that Magic the Gathering has incentivized these things, or these things defined through different play styles in Magic the Gathering.
Yeah.
So I think at the forefront of what we're talking about is interaction.
Yeah.
In that games, especially competitive games, are about interacting with your opponent, right?
You'd hope.
In Magic specifically, the game is built on the need to attack your opponent, theoretically. Attack your opponent with creatures. They can interact with your creatures by blocking them. Creatures are inherently the most interactive type of card in Magic.
Yes.
They have the most axes of interaction, including combat. They're the only cards that interact.
They can deal you combat damage and play cards off your library and ramp you in red. Forget it. My Ragavan rants can
directly
wait.
in combat, inherently. So when we look at 60 card, 20 health Magic,
Mana is very different.
attacking with creatures is usually the most optimal strategy, and that would probably be a good play experience. Theoretically, you have back and forth, you have a lot of decisions, you have a lot of interaction points. I think those are some of the things that define a positive, healthy play environment.
Right.
Negative interaction, a negative play experience, I think is best exemplified through the Lantern Control deck. The infamous Lantern Control. Basically, it revolves around this card called Lantern of Insight, which makes both players play with the top of their library revealed, so that you can see exactly what your opponent is going to draw, and then you play other cards, which makes it so they have to discard the top card of the library, and you can basically ensure that whatever they're going to draw is going to be bad. And this style of like prison deck, right, I think can be enjoyable to play, right?
So I think this is important because there's a very good reason to mention Lantern Control here. And just that last point of, let's work backwards here, just that last point of having folks that do enjoy the play pattern of that deck. And I would say that there are a lot of folks that do have that enjoyment out of it, preventing your opponent from playing the game and putting a puzzle together. There's a lot of elements that need to come together in the Lantern Control deck for it to work. For a lot of you newer modern players, you do have to have multiple things on the board to make it work, because not only are you stopping your opponent from drawing things, ultimately there are going to be times where you don't succeed. You take a card off their library and then they have the same card on top, or they have a better card on top after that. And so you need to have other cards like Ensnaring Bridge and Thought Seizing your opponent and just stopping your opponent in other ways before you can establish a win condition. And what Lantern Control does is does something really interesting where it takes the known information in the game and manipulates that known information into a bad play pattern. Generally speaking, I think a lot of decks that work with known information don't necessarily have bad play patterns. I think the unknown information is what leads to those bad play patterns, aka against Rakdos Scam, when they grieve grief you with the Modern Horizons 2 elementals, the most fair cycle ever printed in Magic. Am I right? When they grief you, you're working with the unknown information of do they have the piece of interaction or not. And so when they play that first grief, that you may have the double interaction spell, but the idea is, do you even spend that interaction spell after they take your first one? Because they may just have a way to reanimate at instant speed. They may just have the counter spell. They may just have the ephemerate, whatever it might be. If you're playing Dimir versus Orzhov Scam or something like that, do they have that option? And so that unknown information is what leads to these bad play patterns, because if the grief combo is allowed to go off, then you're ultimately just going to not be able to advance your board state in the game. And this can be further extrapolated into the twin decks, into the cascade decks, into many other decks that don't necessarily play to the zones that work to you. They work with guessing. They give you skill checks of making the right call. Do you advance your board state, or do you hold up your interaction? That's generally how Magic is dealt right now. Whereas in Legacy, as I was mentioning, your interaction is forceful. It's the free stuff. There are a lot of free spells in Legacy, but it is policed by other free spells. Modern has free spells that don't interact or police the other free spells. So free spells are very different. The way you interact is very different in this format. Things need to have a cost. Things need to have a downside in the modern format, which is why Twin, as I mentioned, I don't think can be unbanned anymore. And I think the Cascade ban was very important, because you need to have stop gaps. You need to not allow these decks to check you with unknown information.
There is an experience to be had there by the player piloting the deck and making those critical decisions about, well, what is okay for my opponent to draw, what isn't okay for my opponent to draw.
Right. It's like if you were traumatized and manipulated as a child, you'll enjoy doing this to other people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you've had no control.
Okay, if you're this far in the video, comment down below if you agree that all Magic players just need therapy. All Magic players need therapy. All Prison players, all Control players, all Blue and Blood Moon players, all of y'all need therapy. Maybe me included, because I'm a mill player, so we all need therapy.
In your life.
Yeah, this is now how you can have that control.
Now you can feel that. You can feel powerful.
Yeah, as you're making everyone else miserable.
I think that is sort of one of the best examples of a control strategy that is a miserable play experience. That's a negative play pattern. We see this play pattern emerge mostly in combo decks, though. Combo decks like Dredge and Storm are like particularly bad ones in this sort of play experience, and that, again, they're very non-interactive. They're just trying to win the game before your opponent can do anything meaningful. And one of the things that got me kind of interested in talking about this is that they spoiled that they're going to reprint Priest of Titania in Modern Horizons 3.
Goated popper card.
And it made me go, well,
Priest.
that's such an odd choice. Like, why pick that card? You know,
It's going to be good for elves.
right. It's very
Okay.
much a I
say that elf is gonna be a combo deck?
An elf deck. Well, there happens to be an elf combo deck that used to be
Elf
very
Ball.
popular, that is not popular anymore, called Elf Ball. The way that Elf Ball plays,
I'm reading
a
them.
combo deck.
I'm
but
reading
it's
them
also
right
kind
now.
of an aggro combo deck, in that your combo pieces are creatures. They're on the board. They are inherently interactable, right? They're there on the board. Your opponent can see your build up to winning the game.
Spoiler alert, I have seen this
and
video already, so I'm not reading them.
that style of play is going to make an opponent feel better about the information that they have, how close you are to winning the game, where are my points of interaction, how do I, like, there's more of a back and forth there.
Yeah.
Where if you compare this to a combo deck like Storm,
So they're just about to go into Storm, but it's very important because it works similar to Lantern Control decks. The problem with Lantern Control is it plays with permanent types that are harder to interact with. It plays a game plan inherently making you lose the ability to interact with certain cards. So Lantern Control generally doesn't work anymore because the lands themselves don't allow you to play these artifacts, enchantments. We have Beseiju that answers artifacts, enchantments now. So the deck is really hard to make work, but generally speaking, it was a hard permanent set of permanent types to interact with, but creatures generally are easy to interact with. Fatal Push was like Fatal Push is an instant spell that generally changed the course of Magic forever, and this is the type of removal that really forces these combo decks out. And so you can interact with Priest of Titania, you can interact with the other elves that exist. And so going into Storm, I imagine he talks
Storm
about
is assembling their combo in
how
their
these
hand, right?
cards
It's all
are unknown
information. It's pretty difficult to tell, unless you're a very experienced player, how close they are to comboing off.
That's key.
And then sometimes when you're playing Storm, you don't even know if you have the combo yet, and you just
go
go
for
and
it.
maybe you get there.
Right.
So that again is an interesting play pattern for the person playing it, but not for the person playing against them. So the point, I think, that hinges on whether a play pattern is sort of good or bad.
Okay.
Or good or bad is probably not the right way to describe it. Positive or negative.
Negative.
What this comes down to is interaction.
Okay.
And I know, like, we were just testing a game that you're working on, and this came up. Very similar thing kind of came up in that players had unknown information, and one player ended up just sort of like winning the game, and everybody else was kind of like, well, I don't know how that happened. It just sort of happened because there wasn't enough information present for the players to really like be able to wrap their head around and and see visually how close somebody was to winning.
Right. The way I like to think about these play patterns is I like to think about like fundamentals of games. And when you look at any game, its fundamental aspects is that you have an objective and you have an interaction that I like to refer to a lot of times as a test of skill. And
so that's where I want to end this video. I want to bring this back around to the twin discussion here. And the idea of the test of skill and known information. That's kind of where I've been building up to. So we have the idea of the Modern Horizons elementals that have that unknown information, that whole rant I went on about with Grief. And we have play patterns that work around known information, like the Lantern Control. And that Lantern Control deck ultimately got pushed out of the format with the type of interaction that exists. So they were playing on an axis, they were playing with known information, and ultimately that type of known information will have will be found out. It will be stopped eventually with the power creep in the format. With better and better interaction that gets printed in Magic the Gathering sets, that will ultimately be stopped. And so the unknown information decks are what thrive. And that's what we see with the Cascade decks. So the Rhinos decks ultimately took over after the banning of Fury, which again, the Fury scam deck, just providing that unknown information of, do you play out your creatures to play into the Fury? Do you even mulligan because they're just going to scam you? All of this led to bad play patterns, and Grief especially led to that play pattern, or still does lead to that play pattern of, you don't know that you've lost this game. You don't know that losing 2 of your cards off the rip loses you this game. You don't know the fact that Fury being 5 mana, unanswerable by Fatal Push, Prismatic Ending, in the traditional removal that exists in the format, made it a bad play pattern. But that happened with Rhinos, where on turn 3 you couldn't advance the board state because you had to expect them to have it. You had to hold up this Fatal Push, you had to hold up the Spell Pierce. And generally what's happening in the Rhinos decks is removal generally exists on 1 or 2 axes, but you can't expect your opponent to have all of them all the time. When it comes to a classical Jund deck, they will usually have a piece of hand disruption, a piece of removal, and a threat, and then a way to advance their board state. So that comes in the form of a Thoughtseize, a Fatal Push, a Tarmogoyf, and then maybe a Liliana the Veil. So the Liliana the Veil advances their board state, the Tarmogoyf is the threat, and then Fatal Push and the Thoughtseize are interactions. The way Cascade decks circumvent this is not only do they create 2 threats with the Crashing Footfalls coming out, 2 Rhinos with Trample, so you can only really Fatal Push one of them, but then Thoughtseize comes down and Rhinos beats that. Rhinos does not require, like Storm does or Dredge does or these other bad play pattern decks, multiple pieces of interaction to exist or multiple cards to come together to combo off. It just needs one enabler to then search for its ultimate I win piece to then just keep going, and you just need to draw that, and then you can play it at instant speed and protect it with Force Negation with the interaction that they're talking about. And interaction is very important, but when it comes to bad play patterns, you don't want the bad play pattern decks to have the best interaction in the format. You want that interaction to have a cost, right? Whereas Force Negation didn't have a cost, but if you had maybe the other 0 mana counter spells in the deck right now, I'm forgetting the name of it, but I'm going to have it up on the screen right now. The 0 cost the 0 cost counter spell, where if it does get countered, sure, it's a hard counter spell. Force of Negation costs only counters non-creature spells, and it costs you a card. But this card, if it does get countered, then you have to pay the 5 on your next turn. There is a cost. You don't necessarily get to go off the turn after. Whereas Force Negation doesn't have that cost. You just have a cost in that moment. After that, you draw and you move on with your life. And therein lies the problem. The interaction doesn't have downside. The combo just goes off and is so hard to interact with. It requires so many cards to overwhelm it. And so you need to play options that just overwhelm this, which leads to a bad play pattern, because it essentially just says you need to play a better deck or just get good, right? And that's where that skill check is of, newer players may not hold up the interaction. They might just advance their board state. They might just play the Teferi. They might just do whatever. but then the opponent goes off from there. And that is why Splinter Twin ultimately, I think, doesn't need to be unbanned. It forces these bad play patterns. And I will say wholeheartedly that I think Splinter Twin is a little weaker than the Rhinos decks because it plays to an axis that is more interactable. The board, you have to have a creature out there that you can put Splinter Twin onto to then go infinite with. So there's a lot more opportunities where you can fatal push it, you can remove, you can solitude it, whatever, and then you can hold up Spell Pierce for the Splinter Twin. Heck, there's going to be a video I'm going to put up on the screen with Corey Baumeister from SCG playing with a friend of his, playing the Hogak deck versus the Splinter Twin deck. And now the Hogak deck ultimately won. That was a bad play pattern deck because it took the graveyard, it took the dredge deck and essentially just threw it on its head, right? Like it used so many good pieces of interaction. It aggroed out everything. It did everything so fast that it was hard for the current iteration of interaction to stop it. Now, of course, if Endurance was in the format, then maybe that might be a little bit different, but then also that could lead to a bad play pattern because it essentially just means you play Endurance or you lose. Right, so Hogak needed to go, but in that video specifically, he was playing. Corey was playing a list. I believe it was Corey anyway, playing a list that had Teferi, that had Force Negation, that had other pieces of interaction. So the deck would have other ways to interact with you, but it also just meant that eventually they would likely get a Splinter Twin off. They would have the interaction that they need. They can work on a different axis to you, especially if they play a card like Teferi that can really stop you from there. And just having these bad play patterns are ultimately why I don't think Splinter Twin should be unbanned. And I hope these two videos highlight that pretty well as to why these bad play patterns are very important to understand in terms of how you use your heuristics to understand what is a bad deck, what is a good deck, and what is just something you're salty about. But let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Let me know if I'm off base. Let me know if I'm just ranting and going too far. I'd love to hear your thoughts about all of that in the comment section. Let's talk about the Splinter Twin unban.